In a packed congressional hearing room, broadcast to over 14 million viewers, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett confronts White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt. After Leavitt's team allegedly doctored a 6-second video to paint Crockett as anti-American. With 327,000 demands for Leavitt's resignation and internal emails proving the clip was edited under her direct orders, Crockett rises, not to defend herself, but to expose a government-led smear campaign. The air cracks as a hidden USB is played before Congress, revealing the full speech they never wanted the public to hear. Two women, one weaponized lie, a nation on edge. If the truth can be edited this easily, then who's really controlling the story America believes? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the piercing white lights of the Fox News studio, the atmosphere crackled with orchestrated urgency. The anchor leaned forward, eyes narrow, voice slow and deliberate. "What you're about to hear," he said, "may be the most dangerous sentence uttered by a sitting member of Congress." Then came the clip. 6 seconds of carefully isolated audio. Jasmine Crockett's voice clear and firm, but amputated from its full meaning. America needs to stop for a while. No context, no lead-in about the justice system, no preamble about structural failure. Just 6 words, floating in a void, divorced from everything that made them human. The camera cut back to the anchor, who raised his brows with theatrical horror. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "This is who's shaping the future of our country." Behind him, a loop of American flags faded into grayscale as drums beat like a funeral march. The framing was unmistakable. Not a critique of policy, but an act of betrayal. Not a sentence out of context, but a woman on trial. Within the next 20 minutes, the segment had been clipped, branded, and injected into the national bloodstream like a viral weapon. Panelists, some ex-military, some ex-candidates, took turns shredding her character. One accused Jasmine of psychological terrorism. Another compared her words to propaganda from hostile regimes. "We bomb countries for less," one muttered. The studio erupted in laughter. But beyond the screen, a darker mechanism had already been activated. Opinion blogs and radio shock jocks echoed the line verbatim, stripping away the last traces of journalistic skepticism. Political operatives saw blood in the water and moved swiftly. A coordinated media surge flooded every time slot with accusations. Is Jasmine Crockett the most dangerous woman in Washington? Headlines weren't questioning, they were prosecuting. By nightfall, Jasmine's office had received over 1,000 threatening messages. Her staffers were rattled, phones ringing nonstop, voicemails overflowing with fury. Local law enforcement advised enhanced security. Her mother called in tears. But perhaps worst of all was what played out inside the halls of Congress. 3 Republican lawmakers, each with ties to Fox contributors, stood before the press with solemn faces and trembling scripts, calling for a full investigation into Jasmine's seditious rhetoric. One waved a printed transcript of the 6-second clip as if it were a smoking gun. "This is not political theater," he said. "This is a matter of national security." No one asked what she had actually said before or after that line. No one dared to play the full speech, because in that moment, truth wasn't profitable. Outrage was, and Jasmine Crockett had been turned into a symbol, one they intended to destroy. And just as the lie took root in the minds of millions, it was given something far more dangerous than oxygen. It was given legitimacy, not by anonymous trolls or late-night pundits, but by the voice of the federal government itself. The James S. Brady Press briefing room was packed, dozens of reporters shoulder to shoulder, red tally lights blinking atop camera rigs like sniper scopes. The mood was brittle. Whispers of Crockett crackled through the air like static. Then the door opened, and Karoline Leavitt stepped to the podium with the composure of someone who knew exactly what kind of power she was about to wield. She adjusted the microphone. Her smile was absent. Her tone was surgical. "Let's be clear," she began, her voice slicing through the room. "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's remarks are not just troubling, they're toxic." Her words landed like gavel strikes. "Dangerous, reckless, the kind of rhetoric that emboldens enemies abroad and destabilizes faith here at home." She paused long enough for every camera to lock onto her face, and then came the sentence that sealed the narrative. "No one who loves this country speaks like that." She didn't shout it. She didn't need to. The weight of the White House was behind every syllable. With that single line, she had transformed a distorted soundbite into a national security indictment. There were no follow-up questions, no pushback, no clarifications, just the low, humming noise of laptop keys and the clicking of lenses, capturing the moment that fiction became federal policy. Minutes later, the official White House X account posted the 6-second clip. No context, no transcript, no attempt at balance. Just the doctored sentence, broadcast from the most powerful account in American politics. Beneath it, the views exploded like a detonation. 1 million in 8 minutes, 3 million in 25. Every retweet, every share, every cold-hearted endorsement pushed the lie deeper into the bloodstream of the nation. Newsrooms echoed it. Cable segments replayed it. And within Jasmine's own party, silence became a shield. Some aides on Capitol Hill quietly unfollowed her. Others asked her staff behind closed doors, "Is this real?" Her integrity wasn't being questioned. It was being publicly executed. And Karoline Leavitt had fired the shot, not with anger, but with precision. Not with a gun, but with a podium. And as the official White House account etched the lie into digital stone, Jasmine Crockett found herself boxed into a corner not of her own making, labeled a traitor by the very institution she served, denied even the decency of a full sentence. She had been reduced to a soundbite, and now she was about to risk everything to reclaim her voice, live unfiltered under the glare of the nation's judgment. Inside the CNN studio, the lights didn't just illuminate Jasmine. They dissected her. Every movement, every blink, every breath was broadcast in high definition to millions waiting to see whether she would crumble, stutter, or snap. But she didn't. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded, the storm in her chest hidden behind armor forged in congressional crossfire. When the host prompted her with the expected, "Congresswoman, did you really say?" she didn't flinch. "What I said," she replied, each word deliberate and carved from steel, "was about a system, not a flag, not a people, not this country, a system that's so broken, so morally eroded, that the only way forward is to hit pause, not to abandon America, but to force it to see itself." Her voice didn't shake. But it wasn't rehearsed either. It was personal, cut from pain and exhaustion, and still, somehow, defiant. "You want to talk dangerous? What's dangerous is letting people weaponize my words while ignoring the machine I was trying to expose." The camera lingered on her face, but no Chiron could contain what she was unleashing. The host remained respectfully silent, letting the moment breathe. Across living rooms and waiting rooms, viewers shifted in their seats, not out of disagreement, but discomfort. Because what Jasmine had done was peel back a truth many preferred to ignore. But the fight wasn't fair. She knew that. Support began to trickle in, messages from activists, lawyers, even a few journalists. But they were soft, fleeting, and cautious. Meanwhile, the disinformation machine kept roaring. Her inbox overflowed with threats. Her voicemails bled with venom. And worst of all, the core accusation remained intact. Because the edited clip, still stood unchallenged by hard evidence. She was telling the truth. But in a war of perception, truth without receipts was just noise. And Jasmine Crockett was running out of time. But as the pressure mounted and the truth continued to drown beneath a flood of manufactured outrage, Jasmine Crockett realized that words, no matter how righteous, were no longer enough. It was time to act. Not to defend herself, but to go on offense. Under the harsh fluorescence of her Capitol Hill office, Jasmine stood over her desk like a general preparing for battle. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a minimalist clock and the distant hum of the evening traffic beyond the bulletproof windows. Her chief of staff watched nervously as she signed the final page. A formal, scathing letter addressed to the chairman of the House Committee on Communications and Digital Integrity. The ink wasn't even dry when she snapped the folder shut and said coldly, "Send it now." The letter was a live grenade. In it, she laid out a detailed case accusing the executive branch, specifically the Office of the Press Secretary, of manipulating federal communication channels to knowingly spread doctored media. It wasn't a complaint, it was a declaration of war. She didn't just call for an inquiry, she demanded it. And more than that, she named Karoline Leavitt personally, not as a staffer, not as a passive participant, but as the architect of the deception. The letter was uploaded to the public congressional record an hour later. The fuse had been lit. Within minutes, the media caught wind. Journalists scrambled. The New York Times ran a late-night headline: Crockett demands federal hearing, Leavitt named in media manipulation scandal. Cable news desks buzzed with the sound of emergency producers. Meanwhile, inside conservative circles, the reaction was immediate and venomous. They called it a stunt, a distraction, an act of desperation. But it didn't matter. Jasmine wasn't bluffing. She wanted a hearing, televised, under oath, with subpoena power. She wanted Karoline under the lights, without the podium, without pre-written talking points. Just her, a chair, and the truth. This wasn't a cleanup job. It was a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett had just fired the first legal shot in a battle that would pull the curtain back on the darkest corridors of American media power. And as Jasmine's letter ignited a political firestorm, the machine she had challenged responded, not with silence, but with a polished face and a performance meticulously engineered for the cameras. Karoline Leavitt walked into the congressional hearing chamber, not like someone under scrutiny, but like someone arriving to accept an award. Her heels clicked with purpose on the marble floor, echoing louder than the whispers that trailed her. She didn't blink at the protest signs outside or the flashes from press cameras lining the corridor. Instead, she greeted chaos with a serene smile. Measured, curated, insincere. Seated at the witness table, she radiated composure, like a pageant queen reciting answers she'd rehearsed in a mirror. Her tailored navy suit was crisp, her gold pin glinting under the overhead lights like a badge of state power. When the chairman asked if she had any opening remarks, she leaned slightly into the mic, voice gentle but sharpened with calculation. Let me be unequivocal. At no point did I authorize, direct, or suggest any manipulation of the video in question. She paused with theatrical control, letting the sentence hang like incense. The notion that I orchestrated such an act is not only false, it is beneath the dignity of this institution. She said it with such calm conviction that for a split second, even some on the dais shifted in their seats. She wasn't denying with desperation, she was denying with elegance. Her eyes drifted toward the camera, not the committee, not the public record, but the broadcast. She knew where the real trial was happening, and then she delivered the line that would dominate headlines by noon. I believe in transparency, I believe in truth, but I cannot be held accountable for what others choose to interpret from publicly available information. It was brilliant in its ambiguity, disavowal without responsibility, apology without admission, and it landed like poison disguised as perfume. Jasmine watched her closely from across the chamber, not blinking, not breathing, not buying a single word. Because in that moment, she understood. Karoline wasn't here to testify. She was here to perform innocence, while hiding behind every loophole power could afford. But as Karoline's polished denials flowed like a perfectly rehearsed aria, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch, didn't interrupt, didn't even blink. Because she hadn't come to match performance with performance, she had come to detonate it. The room held its breath as Jasmine, without a word, reached down and slowly lifted the thick, navy blue binder resting beneath her desk. No theatrics, no grand gesture, just a deliberate motion, quiet as a loaded chamber. She placed it on the table with a dull, heavy thud that echoed louder than any gavel. Fingers precise, eyes steady, she flipped open the cover, revealing a stack of documents, neatly tabbed, cross-referenced, time-stamped. The room shifted. Staffers leaned in. C-SPAN cameras zoomed. The binder wasn't just thick with paper. It radiated tension, as if the truth itself had been compressed and sealed inside. Jasmine didn't speak. She let the gesture breathe, weaponizing silence more effectively than any speech. Across from her, Karoline's confident mask twitched, barely but visibly. And in that microscopic fracture, Jasmine saw what she needed, the first ripple in a wall of lies. The moment before the storm broke, And in the moment that binder hit the table, the illusion began to fray. Not with shouting, but with the cold precision of evidence preparing to draw blood. Jasmine reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and pulled out a small matte black USB drive. No label, no markings, just purpose. She held it up between her fingers, steady as stone, then turned to the chairman and said with quiet authority, "This contains the full recording, unedited, uninterrupted, and uncorrupted." Her voice didn't rise, but it sliced through the chamber like glass. Gasps rippled across the room. Not dramatic gasps, but the sharp intake of breath that follows the smell of gasoline before the first spark. Karoline blinked twice. Her attorneys shifted. Staffers exchanged glances. The chairman looked toward the committee clerk, nodded once, then spoke into the mic. "Congresswoman Crockett has submitted a primary source of material relevance. With consent, it will now be played for the record and for the public." A low hum rose as screens lowered from the ceiling, monitors flicked to life, and C-SPAN's feed went live to the nation. Every lens turned toward a single file, locked and loaded. This wasn't just video. It was testimony, vindication, and confrontation compressed into digital truth. And in that split second before the clip began, you could hear it, the silence of power holding its breath. And as the last pixels of the black screen gave way to the unedited footage, it wasn't just a moment of playback. It was a reckoning unraveling in real time. The full video began without sound, just a wide, steady shot of Jasmine Crockett standing behind a podium at a town hall 2 weeks prior. The camera didn't pan. There were no flashy transitions, no graphics, no ominous music. Just natural lighting, the dull echo of a gymnasium sound system, and a voice, clear, measured, and utterly untouched. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't flailing. She stood grounded in pain and principle, her hands gripping the edge of the podium like it was the last honest thing left in public service. Her voice carried with it something the doctored clip had surgically removed: context, intent, and humanity. "America," she said slowly, "needs to stop. Not to collapse, not to surrender, but to breathe, to look in the mirror. Not for shame, but for truth." The words floated in the room, stark and beautiful. They weren't laced with venom, but with gravity. She paused, her eyes sweeping the small community audience off screen. Then she spoke the line that had been butchered and turned into a weapon. "Because right now our legal system isn't protecting justice. It's strangling it. It's crushing the bones of working people while letting giants walk away untouched." Her voice broke slightly on the word strangling, not from emotion, but from the sheer exhaustion of carrying truths no one else had the courage to say aloud. The crowd in the original video didn't cheer. They didn't erupt. They sat frozen in that awkward, vulnerable space where difficult truths live. The kind of silence that comes not from discomfort, but from recognition. The entire room, the real room, the hearing chamber, was transfixed. Not a single cough, not a shuffle, not even the hum of a phone vibrating could break the weight now settling in the air. This wasn't opinion anymore. This was fact, and it sounded nothing like the caricature Karoline Leavitt and her media machine had manufactured. "On screen," Jasmine continued, her tone unwavering, "if we can't stop long enough to fix what's broken, then what are we preserving? A flag, a song, a set of myths? Or do we still believe that liberty and justice are more than branding?" The power of her original message was disarming, not because it was incendiary, but because it was precise. She wasn't condemning the country. She was demanding it live up to its promises. Back in the hearing room, jaws were slowly unclenching. Aides who had come prepared to rebut started flipping through binders, realizing they had brought knives to a trial of conscience. A senator on the far end of the dais, who had once smirked during Karoline's press conference, now stared dead ahead, face drained of color. One congresswoman, silent until now, slowly removed her glasses and folded her hands. The screen, still playing the raw footage, gave one final blow. "We are not betraying America by calling out its flaws. We betray her when we pretend they don't exist." Then came the silence. No applause, no slogans, just the image of Jasmine stepping back from the podium, the camera panning away, in the screen fading to black. The stillness that followed was more damning than 1,000 accusations. Because it wasn't just the audience in that chamber who had witnessed the truth. It was the millions watching live across the country. The same Americans who had been fed the surgically altered version, who had been told she hated the nation, who had been instructed politely, repeatedly, convincingly to fear her. And now they saw it. The crime wasn't what Jasmine had said. The crime was what had been done to what she said. A congressional aide near the media bench looked over and whispered, "That's not the same speech." The chair of the committee shifted uncomfortably. Someone cleared their throat, but no one dared speak first. The lie had died, but it hadn't gone quietly. It had died under a microscope, with every inch of its ugliness exposed. Karoline, seated just feet away from Jasmine, tried not to move, but the flicker in her eyes betrayed what her body refused to admit. The ground beneath her narrative was collapsing, and Jasmine, still seated, still silent, did nothing. She didn't gloat. She didn't blink. She just breathed. For the first time in days, maybe in weeks, she allowed herself that luxury. Because for the first time, the full truth had been heard. Not twisted, not filtered, not sliced into fragments, but whole. And in a nation addicted to outrage, there was something revolutionary about simply showing what really happened. No dramatics, no monologue, just a file, just facts, just everything the lie tried to erase. And now, it was their turn to explain. And just as the room sat in stunned silence, still reverberating from the weight of the unedited truth, Jasmine Crockett moved, not with triumph, but with terrifying precision. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean into the theatrics. She simply reached into her binder and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper, its surface gleaming faintly beneath the hearing room's sterile fluorescent lights. The weight of that paper wasn't in its thickness. It was in what it carried: intent, motive, authorship. She slid it across the table toward the committee clerk with the same care one might use to place evidence on a crime scene. Her voice, when it came, was cool and unyielding. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her tone stripped of everything except purpose, "this internal memo was forwarded to my office by a source within the Executive Communication Office. It was marked Priority Level Execution. I ask that it be entered into the official record." All eyes turned as the contents of the email lit up the hearing room screens in sharp, unforgiving resolution. At the top, a subject line that dropped like a guillotine. Subject, from the office of Leavitt. Cut the "America needs to stop" line. Enough to spark a firestorm. The language was plain, transactional, utterly devoid of hesitation. Beneath it, line-by-line instructions on how to trim the footage. Timestamps marked, surrounding sentences blacked out, emotional framing recommendations offered like marketing strategy. There were no questions in the memo, only imperatives. And anchoring it all at the bottom, clear as daylight, was the digital signature that ripped through the silence like a rifle shot. Karoline Leavitt, White House Press Secretary. The oxygen in the room thinned. Chairs creaked as members of the committee leaned forward in disbelief. A journalist's pen dropped. A staffer in the corner instinctively turned toward the exits, as if expecting the building to collapse under the weight of what had just been revealed. Even the stenographer, trained in neutrality, paused for a beat too long before resuming. No one said a word, because no one needed to. This wasn't hearsay. This wasn't interpretation. This wasn't political framing. This was an instruction, cold, deliberate, institutional, issued by the most visible mouthpiece of the American presidency to edit, distort, and weaponize a citizen's voice for political gain. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply sat there, still and deliberate, her presence now larger than the walls around her. The injustice she had suffered was no longer a theory to be debated. It was a documented, traceable operation, authorized at the highest level, carried out with surgical efficiency, and aimed directly at her character, her patriotism, and her career. Karoline Leavitt, still seated just 30 feet away, didn't speak. Her jaw was locked in a perfect freeze frame of panic and defiance. But the damage had already metastasized. What had once been a slick denial was now a signed confession, hanging on the screen like a scar that would never fade. And in that silence, colder, deeper, and more suffocating than any protest or chant, the scales shifted. Not because Jasmine Crockett had shouted louder, but because she had done what truth always does when finally allowed to speak in full. She ended the lie. And just when it seemed the tide had fully turned, when Karoline Leavitt's signature hung damningly on the screen and the chamber had been forced to inhale the stench of deliberate distortion, Jasmine Crockett delivered one final move. Not a flourish, but a strike that had been waiting in the shadows. Her tone didn't rise. She didn't gesture. She simply spoke with the calm of someone who knew the truth had backup. Mr. Chairman, I request the committee now hear from a corroborating witness. He served within the White House's Media Strategy Division until recently. His name is Daniel Pierce. Gas didn't erupt. They imploded, quiet but seismic. The doors at the back creaked open, and a tall, pale man in a charcoal suit stepped into view. He wasn't dressed for theater. His expression was not that of a hero, but a survivor. Tight-lipped, eyes hollowed by the kind of fear that doesn't leave when you clock out. As he raised his right hand and swore his oath, the stillness of the room deepened. Karoline didn't look at him. She couldn't. Pierce's voice was brittle at first, like glass trying to hold weight, but it didn't shatter. I was a junior strategist under the Office of the Press Secretary, he began, tasked with preparing multimedia content for public channels. He cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the microphone. Roughly 48 hours before the clip of Congresswoman Crockett was posted, I was called into a closed-door meeting with senior staff. Karoline Leavitt was present. She said, and I quote, "Cut it down to 6 seconds. That's all people need. If we let the rest play, it'll lose its punch." A long breath escaped from someone in the gallery. He continued, his voice firmer now. I asked if that risked misrepresentation. She replied, "That's not our job. Let the media guess. We shape perception. Period." His words didn't echo. They settled, like ash after an explosion. The committee members, moments ago wrestling with the implications of a signed directive, now faced its living execution. Pierce wasn't a partisan warrior or a whistleblower, basking in spotlight. He looked haunted. He looked like someone who had tried to stay quiet and couldn't anymore. We were told that if we didn't deliver a viral-ready version by 6 p.m., we'd be reassigned or worse. The pressure was explicit. The version with full context was rendered and deleted. The only file sent up the chain was the 6-second clip. The screens in the room were dark now. They didn't need to be on. The image had already burned into everyone's memory. Not just a technical cut, not a hasty decision, a directive. Approved, executed, and now testified to. Jasmine sat perfectly still. She didn't nod. She didn't smile. Because this wasn't vindication. This was the cost of truth. A truth she had been forced to drag, inch by inch, into the light while bearing the weight of a country's suspicion. And now that truth had a name, a witness, and a command issued behind closed doors. Cut it down. Just enough to spark the firestorm. And Karoline Leavitt, she authored it. Daniel Pierce carried it. And Jasmine Crockett endured it. Until now. And as Daniel Pierce stepped down from the witness chair, his final words still echoing in the chamber like a slow-moving detonation, the hearing dissolved into a stunned and sprawling silence. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just exposed a lie. She had revealed a blueprint of deceit, a system of manipulation that ran through the veins of the highest office in the land. But the real consequences didn't arrive with gavels or closing remarks. They came after. Quiet at first, then overwhelming. Within 90 minutes of adjournment, the White House servers were inundated, not with policy questions, not with press requests, but with outrage, precise, furious, and unmistakable. Over 300,000 formal demands for Karoline Leavitt's immediate resignation flooded into public inboxes, internal portals, and contact forms. Many came with subject lines like accountability, the lie, or simply enough. These weren't auto-generated petitions or partisan noise. They came from federal employees, retired veterans, public school teachers, pastors, and yes, former Leavitt supporters. And the messages weren't rants, they were indictments. One read, "She weaponized the truth." That's not a mistake. That's a method. Another, "She didn't just lie, she made the government lie for her." By the next morning, the backlash had moved off the screens and into the bloodstream of power. Multiple national outlets released statements distancing themselves from the office of the press secretary. NPR and Reuters formally suspended all direct collaborations. Politico issued a rare editorial denouncing what they called institutional disinformation engineered within the executive branch. But it wasn't just commentary, it was operational. CNN International canceled 3 scheduled interviews with Leavitt. NBC News pulled its embedded producer from the White House briefing room, citing lack of trust in the integrity of the press office. Behind closed doors, a major network executive was overheard saying, "She turned the truth into a clip. Now she's the clip." Inside the West Wing, the fallout was no longer speculative. It was procedural. Daily press briefings were delayed, then quietly removed from the schedule altogether. Several junior staffers in Leavitt's office requested transfers. One high-level aide submitted a resignation, stating in a leaked email, "I refuse to be the mouthpiece of a broken mirror." Even senior White House advisors, those who had once defended Karoline without hesitation, began referring press questions to legal counsel. Her once flawless media control had collapsed in on itself, leaving her isolated in the very echo chamber she had helped build. What Jasmine had endured, weeks of smear campaigns, doctored footage, slander, and silence, was now illuminated in full view. But the reckoning didn't feel like justice. It felt like consequence. And it wasn't orchestrated by the outrage machine. It was driven by clarity, cold, irrefutable, and undeniable. Jasmine Crockett had told the truth, but it was the country, finally, that heard it and chose to remember. And as the dust settled from the political implosion that followed Daniel Pierce's testimony in the flood of public outrage, a weighty, fragile silence enveloped the chamber. The kind of silence not born from civility, but from reckoning. Jasmine Crockett remained seated at the long witness table, eyes steady, hands unmoving, as if letting the full weight of truth settle onto every surface of that room. Around her, the machinery of spin had fallen quiet. Karoline Leavitt sat like a collapsed statue, composed but hollow. The committee's gavel had not dropped. No one dared break the silence. Because for once, the spectacle had ended, and all that remained was truth, raw and uncut, resting between them like a live wire no one was brave enough to touch. Then slowly, Jasmine rose. She didn't need to gather her things. She didn't need to clear her throat or glance at notes. She stood with the stillness of someone who had walked through a storm and emerged carrying its eye in her hands. Her voice, when it came, was low, but every syllable held the gravity of weeks, maybe years, of being silenced, twisted, misunderstood. "Not everyone who shouts is wrong," she began, not looking for applause, only understanding. "And not everyone who smiles is telling the truth." Her gaze swept across the room, not defiantly, not pleadingly, but with the quiet finality of a verdict. "The truth," she said, "is not a 6-second clip. It's not a headline. It's not the version that's easiest to share or simplest to hate. The truth is the whole story, the uncomfortable parts, the parts that get cut, the context that gets buried, the humanity they erase." The weight of her words did not land like a punch. They spread like smoke, slow, suffocating, inescapable. In the front row, a Senate staffer dropped his pen and didn't bother picking it up. At the committee bench, a once skeptical senator leaned back slowly and folded his arms. Not in defiance, but in contemplation. Another older member, a man who hadn't looked up once during the entire hearing, gave a small, near imperceptible nod. Jasmine didn't see it. She didn't need to. She wasn't asking for validation. She was offering clarity. "I stood here today accused of being un-American," she continued, her voice now expanding to fill the room like slow thunder, "because I dared to say that we needed to stop, not to surrender, but to reflect. That justice is not a slogan. That law without soul is violence in a tailored suit." Her eyes finally met Karoline's, not with anger, but with something more devastating, knowing. And when you took my words and turned them into a weapon, you didn't just lie about me. You lied about all of us who are still fighting to make this country live up to what it claims to be. Every second that passed without a cough, without a shuffle, was another admission. The room didn't need to be convinced anymore. It had already heard. Jasmine's presence no longer asked for attention. It commanded gravity. "You can't trim justice into sound bites," she said, eyes locked on the cameras. "You can't crop pain, filter outrage, and sell it as fact." Her hand rested lightly on the table, a symbolic punctuation to the chaos that had unfolded before her. And you don't fix a broken mirror by adjusting your angle. You fix it by acknowledging that it's cracked. One senator exhaled, sharply. Another lowered his eyes in what could only be read as guilt. No one interrupted. No one dared. Because Jasmine Crockett had become more than the target of a political ambush. She had become the one thing more dangerous than anger on live television. A woman who had been lied about and then let the truth speak for itself. "I don't need an apology," she said finally, voice soft but unyielding. "I don't need a retraction. I don't need the clip taken down." She let the silence return for one long second. Then, "I just need you to remember what really happened here. Not the version you wanted, not the one you were told. The real one." She gave one final glance toward the chairman, then calmly pushed in her chair. And the room, this room that had hours ago been a coliseum of accusation and spectacle, was now as still as a church. A holy kind of stillness. No applause followed, no rush of reporters, just the lingering presence of something irrefutable. The truth had entered this space, endured everything thrown at it, and stood taller than the walls built to cage it. As Jasmine walked toward the exit, heels echoing one quiet strike after another on the cold marble floor, even those who had doubted her couldn't meet her gaze. Not because they hated her, but because they had finally seen her. And they had seen what was done to her. And there was no going back. And as Jasmine Crockett's final words faded into the marble silence of the hearing chamber, it wasn't just the room that held its breath. It was Washington itself. Something had shifted irrevocably. The usual fog of spin, of deniability, of plausible confusion was gone. There were no more blurred lines, no more clever defenses, no more rhetorical lifeboats left floating for those trying to escape accountability. The damage had a face, the deception had a name, and the consequences, after so much evasion, distortion, and delay, finally began to move. The announcement came at 9:07 a.m. the following day, in the form of a terse two-paragraph press release from the West Wing's Office of Presidential Personnel. It didn't open with a quote, didn't name a successor, didn't even thank her for her service. It simply read, "Effective immediately, White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt will be placed on a 60-day administrative suspension pending the completion of a full internal ethics investigation." No elaboration, no justification, just a sudden, calculated silence falling over the most recognizable voice in the administration. For a woman once described by cable pundits as bulletproof, the blow was surgical and public. Inside the press corps, the reaction was instant. At the daily White House press briefing, now conducted by a somber deputy assistant communications director, a visible void hung in the room where Karoline had once stood, commanding attention, spinning narratives, choreographing perception like a maestro with a symphony of cameras. Now that podium stood empty, roped off, as if it were part of a crime scene. Reporters, usually combative or disengaged, sat in eerie alignment, exchanging glances instead of questions. No one said it aloud, but the message was clear. The mouthpiece of power had been silenced by the truth she tried to mutilate. In Karoline's own office, blinds were drawn and lights dimmed. Her nameplate had been quietly removed from the door that still bore the gold seal of authority. Staffers who had once recited her talking points by heart now walked in small clusters, whispering to one another in hallways that suddenly felt too loud. Aides who had defended her publicly just days earlier now rerouted calls to legal counsel. The very atmosphere around her had changed. Where once there was deference, now there was detachment. Where once she moved through the corridors with the ease of certainty, now her steps were watched, catalogued, whispered about. But what stung most wasn't the procedural exile, it was the silence from above. The president made no statement. No allies from Capitol Hill stepped forward to defend her character or question the fairness of the punishment. The very administration that had weaponized her voice now treated her absence as a footnote. To the public, she had simply vanished. Internally, it was worse. Meetings were held without her. Email chains removed her from copy. Calendar invites disappeared. The woman who once shaped narratives was now erased from the ones unfolding in real time. Meanwhile, media networks rolled out segments with damning titles: Fall from the Podium, When Spokespeople Go Rogue, and Spin, Suspension, and Silence. Analysts dissected her every move, her language, her decisions, her refusal to apologize, and concluded with almost brutal consensus that the suspension wasn't a mercy. It was a pause before collapse. Political cartoonists painted her standing at a shattered podium, holding a 6-second stopwatch. Editorials didn't speculate if she would return. They debated whether the damage she inflicted could ever be reversed. Karoline herself said nothing. No tweets, no statements, no leaks. The woman who had once held a nation's attention with rehearsed poise now existed only in absence. And that absence thundered louder than any deflection she could have conjured. Her reputation, once gilded with ambition and ferocity, now stood threadbare in the public eye. She hadn't simply fallen out of favor. She had been removed from the stage she helped set on fire. But perhaps the most haunting detail came not from public discourse, but from within her own ranks. A leaked internal memo revealed that her office's badge access had been quietly suspended within minutes of the announcement, digitally locked out of the West Wing's core communication floor. The final line of the memo read like an epitaph: all content approvals must now be rerouted through Compliance Division protocol. Translation: she no longer had a voice, not even in whispers. And as the city moved on, still reeling, still processing, one truth remained. The 60-day suspension was not the end of a scandal. It was the clearest confirmation that everything Jasmine Crockett fought to prove had been real, deliberate, and devastating. For the first time in weeks, the system didn't protect the architect of the lie. It paused her, removed her, stripped the mic from her hand and left her to sit, alone, in the echo of what she tried to fabricate. In the end, it wasn't Jasmine's anger that brought Karoline down. It wasn't even her eloquence. It was her refusal to back away from the full story. Because while Karoline crafted sound bites meant to wound, Jasmine carried truth too big to edit. And in the face of that truth, a suspension was more than punishment. It was admission, a silent institutional acknowledgement that the megaphone had been abused, and now it was time to cut the cord. And while the 60-day suspension rang loud as an institutional admission, it was only the beginning of the storm that now loomed on the horizon. The microphone had been taken away, but the machinery behind it had yet to face the full reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't the only one demanding it. Just 48 hours after the hearing concluded, the House Committee on Ethics released an emergency memorandum stamped in red. Priority inquiry opened. Subject: alleged abuse of executive communication authority. It wasn't just a formality. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of pulling the fire alarm inside a sealed room. The memo cited not only the doctored footage that had triggered national outcry, but also the internal email Jasmine had submitted into evidence, signed by Karoline Leavitt, and the sworn testimony of Daniel Pierce. It referred to potential violations under the Federal Ethics in Communication Act, executive integrity protocols, and misuse of government-funded platforms. The document included over 3,000 lines of flagged correspondence between Leavitt's office and senior media handlers, some marked urgent, others redacted beyond comprehension. But what was clear, even in the fog of legal jargon, was that this was no longer about political optics. It was about criminal intent wrapped in press credentials. By 9 a.m. the following morning, a full panel had been convened in the lower committee hearing room, a chamber notorious for hosting some of the most high-profile investigations in congressional history. Armed guards flanked the entrances. Staffers moved like ghosts, avoiding eye contact, whispering in clipped tones. Dozens of reporters lined the hallway, camera lenses trained not on Jasmine anymore, but on the system itself. Because this wasn't about a bad quote or a media misstep. This was about the possible systemic weaponization of federal communication channels to defame, discredit, and destroy a sitting member of Congress. Inside the committee room, folders were thick and tempers thin. The chair of the Ethics Committee, a former prosecutor known for her no-nonsense approach, began the session not with pleasantries, but with fire. We are not here today to debate media spin. We are here to determine whether a federal officer abused the power of the podium to manipulate public truth. Her voice carried no emotion, but every syllable cracked like thunder. Subpoenas were issued in real time. Key officials from the Executive Communications Office were named. Investigative counsel was granted full access to internal logs, archived press drafts, security-level media distribution platforms, and the personal accounts of senior aides. The investigation zeroed in not only on Karoline's directive, but on the broader system that had allowed such manipulation to flow unchecked. Staffers were summoned. Encryption keys were turned over. It was revealed that the 6-second clip of Jasmine had gone through 3 rounds of emotion calibration using behavioral impact software, government-funded algorithms originally developed for counterterrorism messaging. That single detail sent shockwaves through the panel. The same tools used to destabilize enemy propaganda had allegedly been turned inward, against a domestic political figure who had committed no crime, except telling too much of the truth. Former colleagues of Karoline testified behind closed doors. One, under immunity, described a culture of selective targeting, where edits weren't just suggested, they were demanded. Others revealed internal slang for damaging edits, red chopping, code for slicing context until a, quote, bled controversy. A spreadsheet was entered into evidence, coded by topic, target, and potential viral value. Next to Jasmine Crockett's name were 3 words typed in bold: use the outrage. Outside the committee, the air was electric. Cable news anchors broke from usual programming to stream the proceedings live. Social media feeds filled with stills of documents, audio leaks, and redacted call logs. Civil rights organizations issued formal statements praising the inquiry as a long overdue defense of democratic integrity. Meanwhile, the White House, once silent, was forced to issue a carefully worded response. We respect the independence of the House Ethics Committee and will fully cooperate with their inquiry. But the statement rang hollow. For many Americans, it had come far too late. Karoline Leavitt's legal team, once confident and camera-friendly, now refused interviews altogether. Rumors swirled of plea negotiations, immunity deals, and a quiet reshuffling of White House media leadership behind closed doors. And though the investigation was far from over, one thing had already become unshakably clear. This wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett anymore. This was about every institution that allowed 6 seconds of distortion to become a national narrative. It was about what happens when power hides behind the microphone and calls it messaging. It was about the ethics not of one woman, but of the entire system that enabled her. And in the gallery, watching with her hands folded in her lap, Jasmine Crockett sat with the same unshakable calm she carried into the first hearing, because she understood better than anyone. This was never just about clearing her name. It was about dragging the whole machine, kicking and screaming, into the light. And now that it was here, exposed, dissected on the record, there was no going back. And as the Ethics Committee's investigation carved deeper into the architecture of deception, peeling away layers of institutional rot with every subpoena and sworn deposition, the walls inside the West Wing began to tremble, not from noise, but from silence. Silence in the hallways, silence in meetings, silence on the press floor where rapid-fire messaging once thundered through secure servers. The spotlight was no longer on Karoline Leavitt alone. It now widened to the architects, enablers, and strategists who stood behind her, those who fed the machine, profited from its fire, and vanished when the flames turned inward. It began with whispers. Then came the disappearing names. The first resignation was subtle, an email timestamped at 2:14 a.m., marked effective immediately, from a senior deputy director of media framing strategy. No explanation, no farewell. Just a digital vanishing. By noon, 3 more followed, then 5, then 9. Within 36 hours, a cascading exodus unfolded across the West Wing's communications operation, like a system hemorrhaging from within. Resignation letters, once rare and ceremonially phrased, now arrived in curt bursts, one-page PDFs stripped of warmth, conscience, or remorse. Some cited professional misalignment. Others simply wrote, "I will not defend this." These weren't interns or assistants. They were the spine of the messaging apparatus. People who had once drafted presidential sound bites, advised cabinet-level responses, and engineered rapid response campaigns that shaped the national narrative in real time. Now they were ghosts, some deleting LinkedIn accounts, others quietly entering law firms, consulting firms, or simply disappearing into the ether. A few, under condition of anonymity, spoke to the press. One former senior framing advisor told The Atlantic, "There was a moment when we stopped telling the story and started deciding who deserved to speak at all." Another confessed, "We didn't just build a narrative, we buried people in it." The internal collapse wasn't just symbolic, it was operational. Meetings were canceled, files went untouched, projects stalled mid-sentence. Inside the West Wing's communication bullpen, desks sat empty, monitors dark, Slack channels untouched since the day of the hearing. The press pool noticed. For the first time in years, reporters described a White House comms team that felt vacant, not just short-staffed. In one press briefing, a substitute aide stuttered through questions, unable to confirm even basic schedule points. There was no backup, no fallback strategy, only a widening absence where once there had been control. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained silent, not out of satisfaction, but out of reverence for what it had taken to get to this moment. The woman once accused of being dangerous to democracy now watched as the very people who crafted that narrative fled the system they once commanded. Each resignation, each vanishing signature was an unspoken confession. Because these weren't people ousted by vote or scandal. They chose to leave, not in protest, not in defiance, but in surrender to a truth they could no longer contain or outrun. Even the media, once hesitant to name names, began publishing lists. The 12 who stepped down, the architects of the 6-second lie, who knew and when. One editorial in the Washington Post summarized the moment with brutal clarity. It wasn't one woman's lie. It was a system's choreography. And now, the dancers are gone. The damage wasn't just to reputation, it was to memory. Americans had seen how truth could be carved, twisted, monetized. And they had seen who did it. The power wasn't just gone, it had resigned. By the end of the week, the White House had quietly launched a recruitment push to rebuild its shattered media arm. But every announcement was met with scrutiny, suspicion, and the echo of what had already collapsed. Because the public understood something Washington rarely admits. You can replace a title, but not the stain it leaves behind. And no matter how many desks were refilled, one fact remained scorched into the foundation of that building. Those who shaped the distortion walked out not because they were told to, but because they finally saw what they had become. And in that realization, they chose to leave the lie behind. But the consequences they helped birth, they would echo far longer than any resignation. And as the last resignation cleared the air like the final crack of thunder after a long, slow-moving storm, the nation exhaled. But Jasmine Crockett did not. The media machine that had tried to grind her into a meme had collapsed in on itself. The press room that once mocked her with strategic silence now echoed with unanswered questions. And the administration that enabled the distortion had been forced to watch as the very architects of its narrative fled their offices one by one. But Jasmine knew something most people didn't. Public collapse isn't the same as public clarity. And if there was one battlefield left, it was the war for memory, for context, for who would own the story after the headlines faded. So she chose the place where truth is often buried before it's born. The university, not just any university, but Howard, the crown jewel of Black intellectual tradition. The institution that had trained generations to question not just power, but the systems that define it. On a rainy Friday afternoon, she stepped through the arched gates of the campus, flanked not by security or fanfare, but by the weight of her own vindication. The invitation had come from the students themselves. Over 200 signatures gathered in 48 hours, demanding she speak. Not just as a congresswoman, not as a survivor of a political hit job, but as a truth teller, someone who had walked through fire and refused to let the smoke rewrite her name. The auditorium was standing room only. Students jammed into aisles. Faculty stood along the walls. Journalists lined the back row with cameras on silent record, unsure whether they were covering a lecture or witnessing the start of something larger. Jasmine took the stage in a black blazer, her Howard pin glinting faintly beneath the lights. She didn't carry a script. She didn't need one. Her hands were steady. Her voice was calm. But her presence, it crackled like electricity before a lightning strike. "They thought they could shrink me into 6 seconds," she began, her tone measured but sharp. 6 seconds. That's all they needed to flip the script, weaponize it, and point it back at me like a loaded gun. The crowd was silent, not passive, but locked in. They said I hated America. They cut out the part where I begged her to wake up. She stepped forward, her voice firm but never forced. "I didn't say burn it down. I said stop. Breathe. Look in the mirror." And they called that treason. She let those words hang. The stillness in the room wasn't quiet. It was pressure, building in the lungs and hearts of every student staring up at her. "Let me be clear," she continued. "Truth does not live in a soundbite. It does not live in a tweet or a 10-second reel or a chyron flashing across the bottom of your screen. Truth has a body. It has scars. It has roots that grow through time, through pain, through systems built to erase it." Students nodded. Professors leaned forward. Even the reporters in the back began to lower their cameras, not because they weren't recording, but because they were listening. "The system didn't come after me because I lied," she said. "It came after me because I told the truth out loud, in front of too many people, without asking permission." She paused, one beat, then two. "And you know what scares them more than truth?" Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow felt louder than any shout. "The idea that you might hear it and not look away." A murmur ran through the crowd, not discontent, but recognition. This wasn't politics. This was anatomy. Jasmine dissecting the machinery that tried to collapse her, exposing the blueprint of the lie they'd built to silence her. "They didn't just try to discredit me," she said, pacing the stage slowly. "They tried to curate the public mind. They chose which pieces of me were palatable, which ones were profitable, and which ones had to be deleted." She stopped at the center of the stage, eyes blazing. "Because if you control the edit, you control the emotion. And if you control the emotion, you control the nation." The room held its breath. She let the silence bloom. Then came the line that would be printed on posters, quoted in op-eds, and replayed across every major network for weeks. "The truth can't be sliced into clips like a TikTok. If you listen long enough, really listen, you'll realize I was never the one afraid of America waking up." Thunderous applause didn't erupt. It boiled, slow and rising, like something building from the pit of collective memory. Jasmine stood still as it swelled, letting the roar wash over her without flinching, because she hadn't come to be celebrated. She had come to finish something. And then her voice quieted the room one last time. "So I leave you with this. If the truth can be bent this easily, if it can be reshaped, sliced, branded, and sold in pieces until we don't recognize it anymore." Her gaze swept across the sea of young, attentive faces. "Then who's really running this country?" There was no answer. There didn't need to be. Because the silence that followed wasn't ignorance. It was awareness, awakening, and the beginning of a new story. And as the echoes of Jasmine Crockett's speech at Howard continued to ripple far beyond the walls of the university, a deeper current began to move beneath the surface of the national conversation. A current not made of headlines or political maneuvers, but of meaning, of reckoning. What happened to Jasmine wasn't just a scandal to be dissected or a controversy to be debated. It was a mirror held up to the American conscience. And what stared back was more than discomfort. It was a question we hadn't dared ask in too long. What does it cost a person to tell the truth when the world is built to silence them before they finish their sentence? And more importantly, what does it cost us all when we let that happen? The human lesson buried in this storm wasn't just about media distortion or political abuse of power. It was about the architecture of erasure. Jasmine Crockett wasn't targeted for being dishonest. She was targeted because her honesty was inconvenient, because she dared to speak in full paragraphs when the world only had the attention span for sound bites, because she carried a truth that couldn't be trimmed down without bleeding. And so they didn't just go after her words, they went after her wholeness. They broke her into clips, quotes, and caricatures. They turned her into a threat, not by what she said, but by what they refused to let her finish saying. And yet she stood. And in that standing, in that refusal to shrink, Jasmine gave us a human lesson that will outlive every op-ed and every scandal. To be whole in a world that profits from fragments is the most radical act of all. She taught us what it means to hold space for truth, even when it's ugly, even when it's slow, even when it doesn't come with a headline-ready hook. She reminded us that truth doesn't always arrive with polish or perfect cadence. Sometimes it comes shaking, sometimes it comes angry, sometimes it comes dressed in the pain of 1,000 people who've been silenced before. But when it comes, when someone like Jasmine dares to carry it through a storm of slander, lies, and silence, we must listen, not to defend her, not to pity her, but because what we learn in those moments is not about her, it's about us. What Jasmine endured revealed something terrifying. How easily a system designed to inform the public can be turned into a weapon of narrative warfare. But what she showed us, in turn, was something even more powerful. How a single human being, armed only with clarity, restraint, and truth, can withstand that weapon and expose it for what it is. Not with screaming, not with vengeance, but with presence, with integrity. That's the lesson that lingers after the lights go down. That courage is not the absence of fear. It's the refusal to let fear rewrite who you are. Because here's the brutal truth. Jasmine was never protected. Not by her title, not by her party, not even for a long time, by public opinion. She stood alone in a room full of microphones pointed at her, but none of them turned toward her. And in that moment, she made a choice that few ever make. She spoke anyway. And that choice repeated again and again through every attack, every edit, every viral lie. That choice was the lesson, the human lesson. That integrity is not situational. That dignity is not disposable. And that truth is not a luxury. It's a responsibility. When the smoke cleared, Jasmine didn't ask for revenge. She didn't demand apologies or settle for applause. She asked for one thing, that people remember what really happened. Not the clip, not the spin, the whole story, because that's what truth deserves. That's what every person deserves, to be heard not in pieces, but in full. And when she stood at Howard University and delivered that final question, if the truth can be bent this easily, then who's really running this country? She wasn't just calling out corruption, she was calling in conscience. Because the lesson isn't just about media, it's about us. What kind of nation do we become when we let lies trend faster than truth? When we share outrage more easily than context? When we're quicker to condemn a person than to listen to what they're actually saying? Jasmine Crockett stood in the middle of that question, not with fury, but with faith. Faith that somewhere in this bruised, distracted country, there were still people who would choose depth over distortion, substance over spectacle, humanity over hashtags. And in that faith, she was right. Because the story didn't end with her defeat. It ended with her teaching us how to listen again, not with our ears, but with our conviction, with our willingness to sit in the discomfort of a truth that refuses to fit neatly inside a soundbite, with our ability to look at someone who's been misrepresented, misunderstood, and misused, and say, "We see you fully." That is the human lesson. That is Jasmine Crockett's legacy. And if we carry it forward, if we hold the line when the next voice is cut, when the next truth is trimmed, when the next person is turned into a headline before they can finish their sentence, then what Jasmine endured will not have been in vain. It will have been a beginning. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.